So given you're effectively on summer recess, when you say get back into a pattern, are
Hmm.
you somebody who prefers doing, say, as one obvious option is, I'll do maybe 3 or 4 hours a day every normal working day, or do you do the other thing and say, I'll go in all day Tuesday and Thursday, such that I get quiet office time in the
Right.
morning and quiet library time in the afternoon because you might need to use both,
Hmm.
or are you completely random on that? I'm always curious about how people find the easiest ways to operate.
Yeah, I have some friends who actually sort of went out of their way to schedule their courses so they would have long weekends, so their courses would be mostly on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and and they wouldn't have to to be on campus on Friday and all of that. I you know I haven't really tried to do that. As it turns out, right now, I'm getting I'll be this fall. I'll be getting a 3 credit release, so I'll only have 3 courses to teach instead of 4. One of them will be online, and so one of them is Monday, Wednesday, Friday, the survey course, and then the other one, which is a kind of an upper level discussion course, is Tuesday, Thursday, because the hour is 50 minutes on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and an hour and 15 on Tuesday, Thursday. So so I'll really only have one course on campus each day of the week. And then I'll have this online environmental history course that I'll be kind of sort of constantly dipping into, but I won't have a scheduled synchronous meeting time.
Oh, I was more thinking within the recess period,
Well,
like now.
yeah, like now I've had whole weeks where I've gone away. I went up camping, and then I've been sort of trying to be. It's kind of weird because I sort of feel like I'm trying to push a bunch of rocks up the hill simultaneously. Which is not to say that I'm thinking of it as a as kind of as a Sisyphean or futile thing, but just that I'm trying to, hey John, um, trying to kind of keep things moving, and kind of keep going on each of my projects, whether it's my own research, or my prep for the next semester, or or reading, this reading, or anything else that I might be um, you know that I might be engaging. So I do try to kind of work a little bit. Yeah, I've sort of tried. I haven't been trying to evade your question, Tim, but I guess what I have been doing is I've been trying to do a little bit, trying to do it, to work it so that, yeah, I don't have, okay, today's the day that I do research, or today's the day that I do this, or today's the day that I teach. I try to have a little block of time each of the days that I'm working, and usually that's 6 or 7 days a week, and then have and actually be able to sort of switch gears. I guess there are times when I get so deep in the weeds that I do, 5 or 6 hours will go by, and I have, and I've been in the zone, so I've allowed myself to sort of continue a research thing, or a writing thing. And Yeah, and I mean, and I think if I don't put myself in a position where where I by doing that I miss a deadline or something like that, then I'm kind of happy with that sort of arrangement.
So a real laissez-faire, really.
Um,
Adam Smith and all that.
yeah, I guess I try to, well, and I was a little bit inspired by the whole that sort of testimony of Luhmann filtered through Aaron's, right? That never work on anything that you're not that you're not interested in, that you're not excited about at the moment. I think that's I haven't been able to, to do that 100%. Okay, which Mark are we talking to here? I can't actually hear you, but I can see you from two directions.
Mute
No
two times.
microphone.
Oh, but now the mute thing is on, so maybe the mic is working and you're just muted now. Mm-mm.
This is the time it absolutely convinced me that the moon landings were a Hollywood.
Or a hoax. Yeah.
He looked so much more frantic though with two video cameras. That's the best part.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He really looks like he's working hard to fix it. And I can commiserate because
We got you.
Even I had problems this morning.
I traded in my old Mac and bought a Mac Mini, and I can't get the sound from you, so I'm listening on my iPad.
Oh, okay. and we're hearing you from the Mac Mini apparently, because it's not the iPad that looks like it's lit up now. Yeah.
Put your microphone behind the speakers though, so you don't get the feedback loop.
Right.
If it's possible.
That just part of the reason why the moon landing thing came up was there was a you to me version of the meme came through that said, and they got the guy that did 2001.
Mm-hmm.
What his name
Kubrick,
was.
yeah.
Kubrick. They got Kubrick to do the direction, but he's such a perfectionist, he had to do it on location.
That's funny. Yeah. It's weird. I saw a whole bunch of talk about how it was Kubrick, it was Kubrick, and it's like, well, okay, whatever. So we haven't talked in a while. I did just kind of review the last 3 chapters of this book. I thought it was kind of interesting how how kind of close to the present he gets. So I wasn't that surprised that he talked about GPT. I was a little bit surprised that he seemed to anticipate the Oppenheimer movie. And it occurred to me that when he was going there, when he was talking about Oppenheimer and Feynman and everything, whether that was really consciously aware of, he was focusing on that because he knew that was going to be something that people would be thinking about the time the book was current.
I don't know if he planned it. I mean, Hollywood production schedules mean that he could easily have looked it up and known it was coming out.
Yeah.
And probably slated for a summer release.
Right. There's been talk about it for a long time. Yeah.
But I almost felt like that section was his kind of build up to why have I written this thing from the start? Here's the thesis that I want you to take away from the book kind of thing. Although I think the way he built it into the book, given how the book had been just like short little episodic kind of history pieces along the way, I don't know that it had the impact he might have wanted it to have because of that structure. But that's the closest thing I think I could to here's why I've written this book is for this thing. But then his argument for it wasn't as strong or well structured as it could have been to have that with I mean, if I didn't come into it with a general agreement with him on that idea, but he doesn't presuppose any game theoretic arguments against his thesis either. It's just kind of here's this thing, we should we should be wise.
Yeah,
When-
we should be wise. Yeah, and we should be
Kind of
wise.
falls flat for me.
And yet, in at the beginning of chapter 6, he's going on, he's going down little rabbit holes of kind of not uninteresting, but apparently directly relevant trivia, like Ramanujan's interest in the the cube, sums of cubes. That was interesting, but it seemed to me was maybe another one of those instances of I have this in my Zettelkasten, I jam it in.
In fact, actually, that section I think was one of it was surely one of the last ones he wrote, and one of the least kind of well edited, because it's also one of the sections that each piece was not self-contained, and more of those sections bled over, or there were one or two short kind of interstitial sections that he put into that bigger piece of kind of a list of people, where he would have a short section that kind of says, here's where we're going before he went there, which he had not done the entirety of the rest of the book. So some of those pieces actually started, or that chapter started to show I'm going to start here and end up here type of writing through line, which he really hadn't done. Almost every chunk of section of chapter was a freestanding piece you could read on its own without any other context from any of the rest of the book.
Yeah.
Which seemed weird to me. It was like suddenly a style of the book had changed.
Yeah. Yeah. Bertrand Russell eaten by polar bears.
That was new to me. That was one of the few.
That was weird. Yeah. I mean, I do like, and I think that he's aware that he appeals to people who just like hearing little anecdotes like that, like these little, sort of collections of interesting facts and whatnot. It's almost kind of a P.T. Barnum or Ripley's Believe It or Not kind of.
Or my favorite, and he didn't, other than throwing it out there, and I don't even think he said it specifically, here's the thing, but essentially he talks about Russian interference in British elections in 1924. Where was it, on page like 230, 239 somewhere? And I was like, hey, like this is interesting, like get into this a little bit, but it's here and then gone.
Right. So and nothing about about the Brits and the Americans in Siberia supporting the White Army at roughly the same time, which also seems to be kind of his in his wheelhouse, right? That that there's little that there's often kind of little real kind of critical analysis of
there's
our teams.
Quite a few of these stories seem to have lots of stuff that you may or may not know, but then you also pipe up and think, well, he hasn't mentioned so. And like with his big thing about, I can do Google searches. Does this is this part of the degeneration of learning and understanding and all the rest of it?
Right.
Yet.
And that I thought was interesting.
Well, I thought there was two things that came from that, and there's always a possibility I might have missed it. But there was nothing really to say about what's the cost of ownership. Like if you use, even in the UK, we used to get the Encyclopedia Britannica guy around at least once a year trying to flop off the 50 odd volumes that it was, whatever.
Right.
But it's yeah, but I have materially no cost of ownership for Wikipedia, right? And I have virtually instant access, and because it links, I can follow a story of my own making. Yet and in all those other stats about what you could do with Google and look things up and how many hits you have. And as I said, even in this group, there's I got a 0 or a 1 with Google the other day, which was quite surprising. But he missed completely the whole fake concept of flat Earth.
Mm-hmm.
Prior to whatever the date was, I forget the date now, but early 1990s, there was like 2 hits in terms of information about flat Earth over each decade or something. And now, of course, it's like 2 a minute. And it's almost down, totally driven from Google.
783 million results in 0.31 seconds.
Yeah, but
top line is Wikipedia, and then there's a Scientific American. Third one is
debunking it.
Debunking it. But then the third one is Flat Earth Brewing, which is a St. Paul beer company. Apparently, didn't know. But the another interesting element. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Tim.
It seemed an odd omission comparatively, and I felt like that all the way through. So the other one that riled against me was obviously we're seeing from early on to almost all the way through this keeps going back to this boat trip and being able to navigate across an empty ocean, honestly, as though that's the only purpose of maps. Yet, of course, route finding. So you go look at, and he talks about the British maps, the Ordnance Survey maps, which are down to 2.5 inches to a mile for everywhere, right? And they've metricated it and they've updated it, and they get updated about every 10 or 12 years. Yet, prior to that, the map that you got for your journey from London to York was a strip, like a paper tape from a computer, showing you the route, regardless of bears, but with all the junctions and all the stops and all the places to get overnight stays and food and drink. But it was literally a strip of paper. And London to York along the A1 is pretty much a relatively straight road, but it's not as straight as a Roman road. And it's like, there's no mention of the thing that GPSs have now done is taken away the skill of reading a map, not finding a route, but reading a map, such that you can tell, I can look at a map, because I'm old enough, and say what the countryside looks like over the next hill from a British Ordnance Survey map, right? You can't do, etc. And or you can't easily find alternative routes
because none of that's relevant, right? As long as you get from point A to point B, there's no interest in anything that happens along the way. Just get the turns right.
Well, if all you're worried about is taking a route, a predetermined route, you're fine, right? But if what you want is to go and explore, you've got a fundamentally different problem.
Right, which is a really interesting metaphor for my, for my Zettelkasten, my knowledge, graph, right?
Absolutely.
That I've always sort of thought of it as this, as this forest, and I can wander, I can take a path through the forest, and it would be that one-dimensional strip of paper, right? That says, point A, B, C, D, E, F, ultimately Z, and ignores the universe of other things adjacent and the context that might make it richer, right? That's an interesting But it does seem like that what he's talking about there when he's describing that 43-year-old root finder guy that they found in 1976, that he was that the way that he did it was completely about the context, right? He was laying in the bilge, listening to the sound of the waves, which I imagine had something to do with the direction and frequency of where the waves were hitting the boat, which probably told him something about where he was in the ocean. All the things that all the cues that he was getting were contextual, which is the exact opposite of that strip of paper, isn't it?
Yeah, I particularly like that section too, although he doesn't, he doesn't go into a lot of depth in how that's done or how those practices are done or how they're taught and passed on, which was kind of the ultimate part of that section too, was here's a new generation of kids essentially who can learn to do this, but he doesn't say exactly what it is they're learning to do. So it's presented to Western audiences as here's this magical thing that just can happen the same way, if you don't know about, mnemonic techniques or things like some of them seem like magic because people can just do them. And it's like, oh, how do they do that? And it's left as a pure magic trick of how it's done. Just here's this thing. And it would have been so much better if you gave us another page of kind of, at least here's a hint of how this is done so you can go look it up.
Yeah.
Instead, it just presents it as here's a thing and people are doing this with no context thereafter.
Right. Well, and it's a different sort of thing, right? Which I thought would have been valuable because that seemed to be the point that he was trying to make, was that this is and actually in that conversation that I had with my dean yesterday over lunch, we talked a little bit about the issues that our university is having, but then we also sort of talked about humanities, because she's the dean of the College of Art, Education and Humanities, and I'm in the humanities department. And we've been talking about since we started playing around with ChatGPT last semester, that maybe we could understand our role. If there's always been an argument about the liberal arts and why we learn these things and and this these ideas of critical thinking and all that, but now also I think additionally because it was interesting. I've said in the past that I haven't been that impressed with with kind of essays that I've gotten out of GPT-3, but I haven't tried GPT-4. And I was listening to, I don't even remember who I was listening. I was listening to some podcast this week, and somebody was saying GPT-4 is the bomb. That's kind of the for this person who was some type of educator, was said that that's kind of the step change. That's kind of where nobody can write as well as no human can write as well as GPT-4 as fast, right? I mean, based on that idea that it comes back to you within seconds, and that has has a bunch of its own interesting sort of implications and questions that I could follow up with about, is that still just, sort of convergence to the mean, figuring out what the next word is based on a bigger and better set, and how does that destroy sort of all of the human effort that went into creating all of that presumably copyrighted material. But be that as it may, that this is that maybe what we should be focusing on. I was saying to my dean was what is it that makes us uniquely human, and how can we learn to be more? How can we teach people to be more? To lean into those things that humans can do well that machines can't. And I thought kind of that was where he seemed to want to be going with this, right? Was this idea that, you know, that this person has, because they used to, you know, Arthur Clarke said, you know, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, right? And that's one kind of magic. But it seems to me like there's another kind of magic, which is this thing that this route finder had, which was so much knowledge and experience that it had become internalized and, you know, and sort of automated to the point where it was almost instinctual, right? So you don't have to, and that might be, Chris, one of the reasons why, you know, Winchester is having trouble sort of distinguishing these steps and saying, okay, this is what he does, and this is what he does, and this is how we learn to do it, and this is what he learned, this aspect of it, you know, because it's become such a kind of a gestalt thing by this time that also is magic.
Yeah.
Right, but
Well,
the
issue I think for that indigenous elder is typically in those societies, you grow up learning bits and pieces along the way, and you're kind of initiated into sets of knowledge. So when we see most indigenous practices, we're getting the kindergarten version of what they're doing.
Mhm.
And unless you're a part of the tribe or the group or the society, you're not going to get beyond that level of knowledge to know the things that he would have known. But he's got domain specific area knowledge of animals and how animals react, what specific birds look like, where they fly, why they fly in which directions, where they get food. He knows about ocean related things, what the waves are doing, what certain wave crests and types mean and look like.
Mhm.
And he's got 10 times, I guarantee you, 10 or 100 times more knowledge about the stars than most astrophysicists do. Now, they may know the physics part, but can they look at the sky and name every single star that exists in the sky? He probably can.
Yeah.
And he knows how that maps onto spaces on the earth. But he does that, and it's, you know, 10 different domains of knowledge he's acquired that allow him to do what he's doing. In addition to how do you fish on the boat and sustain yourself for days or weeks at a time on a boat in the ocean.
Right.
And, you know, so, and we're missing all that. So I think he lost an opportunity to say, he kind of waves at it. And I like that you kind of bring up the idea of magic, because Winchester uses the phrase modern magic in the subtitle of the book. And almost all of I looked in almost all of the instances of the 20 or so, I think, that were in the book, and I haven't written it down yet, but most of them were kind of the magic of electricity are the modern magic he's talking about, rather than you know, there's one or two times he says the magic of print, I think, or kind of a general magic knowledge, but he doesn't have a consistent use of how he's using the word magic and what does it mean versus, let's say, you know, general prestidigitation or magic as we may view it in religious contexts or older indigenous contexts, which I think Western anthropologists just don't get as a whole. They're missing a lot of context to be able to situate it.
Right. Magic, a lot of magic of, I just typed it into the Kindle search feature, and there's molecular magic. There's a lot of magic of electricity, electronic magic, 163, 165, 175, magic of printing, magic of moving pictures, GPT magic. Yeah, so there's a lot of that.
I think there was one AI magic thing in the end. Although I will give him credit, although I think the state of the art of what we're all talking about in the ChatGPT AI space, he would have had to have written most of that at the very latest about 4 months before the book came out. So he's writing November, December at best. And what he's written here is at least as good as, if not better than, almost everything else that's out there on the topic right now. Because most people, I think, are fumbling about in the dark.
Yep.
How about though, if, talking about the seafaring skills, and, you mentioned context. If you kind of try to compare this to what AI is based in context, what it really amounts to are weightings associated with variables. Maybe there is no explanation. Or, it's like you were mentioning relative knowledge to astronomers. It's a different kind of knowledge. It isn't like explain why this phenomena exists. You don't care why the phenomena exists. You just have recognized somehow, maybe through vast experiences that are even below the level of kind of conscious processing, what are correlates of something, like the direction you're going and where things are. That's, like people keep looking for explanations, I think, and maybe it's not really explanations that's at work here. It's really correlates of an outcome, correlates to predict an outcome.
I'd probably challenge our Polynesian canoeist to name every star he could see when he's sort of midway between Midway and Iwo simply because there is no light pollution at that point. He would have a really hard job of naming them all. But I also think that there's an issue of he didn't tell us, and this is where I agree with Chris, he didn't actually tell us. We haven't yet got to junior school and never even got to high school in those contexts. What does this old guy tell the young guys? What he's doing, what he's actually listening for, and does he actually have the language for it? Because it's things like, I'm pretty sure that I could talk to my grandson and say, it's like brass monkeys out there, and there would be a complete blank as to what the hell a brass monkey is. And it's only like 200 years since we stopped using them. And more importantly, why is it not actually seemingly as though it's a polite way of saying some swear words, because that's what it sounds like you're trying to do, because there are a number of people of even my kids' generation that actually know what a brass monkey is probably going to relatively few. And how many more words are like that? I mean, one of the words he's used, and I can't remember now, when he was talking about Babbage, whether he actually went back a little bit to remind us that a computer was normally a person who had the skills to use things like log tables and ready reckoners to do calculations quicker. That's why they gave, and we were talking about Trinity a moment ago and Oppenheimer, and what's Richard Feynman's role? Richard's role in that project was to run the calculation team of high school grads doing the calculation manually a number of times to see that they all got about the same answer to make sure it was correct. So even that, 1940s, we weren't playing, clearly not with a Texas Instrument 2210 or whatever it was in the book, right? So, and of course, you then got the software and proper computers, as we know, coming up in time for the late Apollo missions, but the early ones were all relatively hand calculated.
Yep.
So that whole thing shifted in our life.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and one of the things that strikes me about this train of discussion is sort of the interdisciplinarity that Chris and Mark were talking about too, of knowing that this, connects with that, and this, and we have sort of course, in higher education, especially, have sort of imposed disciplinarity on created fields of knowledge, right? That that have some type of logical basis, but sort of necessarily exclude a lot, in order to sort of focus, right? So it's kind of a very tight beam, and that element of kind of the and of course, and I guess the other thing that struck me was that the sort of 10,000 hour rule, right? That that this guy who is at 40, whatever he was, 43 or 46, was sort of an elder and the master of this navigation, that had almost disappeared from the earth. Wasn't spending his time, watching TV, or doing anything else, right? He was living this, constantly, 100% of his time, and and accruing these little,
But it came over to me as being a very craft orientated level, such that if you were something akin to a real scientist and tried to actually abstract it down to an equation and understood that, if you were even half as good as this guy and they picked you up from the Pacific and dropped you into the Atlantic, you'd still function. Whereas if you picked him up and dropped him into the Atlantic, he'd be lost, because none of the sounds, none of the waves, none of the directions, none of the islands exist.
Mm-hmm.
He'd have the same sky, but not the same sea.
But how long? Yeah, but then the question is, how long would it take him to, he lost all of the data on,
yes,
but he still retains all of the algorithms, right? So how long would it actually take him
I agree.
to fit data to these things that he understands, and and find his way?
His knowledge of the stars will probably be a big savior, but he's also going to know wind patterns that he's used to in his original location aren't going to exist, but he's still going to know wind blowing one direction or another means something.
Mm-hmm.
Or when he puts his hand in the water, the flow of the water underneath him means something.
Mm-hmm.
The birds will change, but what the birds are doing and why they're doing it won't change. Right. So my guess is he still will be incredibly well equipped to find his way back to land somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
But go ahead.
The obvious comparison is if you look at certain things built by carpenters and certain things built by stonemasons, they use at one set of ages, they use very similar shapes and techniques like mortise and tenon joints, etc. But you don't see that many people working at craft level in both spheres. Mm. So yeah, it would be an interesting experiment to be able to pick this guy up and drop him into the Atlantic with a canoe and say, "Here you go," or cheat, or cheat and drop him in the Caspian Sea.
Yeah. Well,
don't be too much of a bitch and drop him in the Dead Sea, but drop him in the Caspian Sea, and say, "What now?" Because now we would see very quickly just how much scale has something to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
Because clearly Caspian is orders of magnitude smaller than either of the two.
Mm-hmm.
And there isn't, outside of things like the Gulf of California or something, which is a nice long straight very simple shape compared to like the Gulf of Arabia or Persian Gulf.
Mm-hmm.
and yet nothing at all like the Gulf of Mexico, such that how would you really know if you're in the Gulf of Mexico versus the open Atlantic from the ideas from the Pacific? There isn't, in the bulk of the Pacific, until you start getting into Indonesia and the Philippines and all those dense islands that are well stretched out, that are half a day apart, etc., compared to, what's the journey time? As we said, what's the journey time between Midway and Iwo Jima by canoe? 3 days, 4 days, 5 days? I've got no idea. But it's not half a day. It's not like me standing on the cliffs of Dover and looking at Callao. It's 25 miles away. So it's like, and the context of a knowledge of a language that goes with it, as in how specific does some of that information become, because all these fields that we talk about, and I saw, Mark picked up about the more and more specialization, assuming depth is key, is we all start to use language, and as though there are as many words as there are in English, that most of which we don't use, we still find that a word has multiple meanings depending on the technology or the industry or the jargon zone or whatever, such that how would somebody in the situation of not fully understanding what's just happened to him being dropped into the Atlantic? It looks like an ocean, it feels like an ocean, but all the details are wrong once he's actually sat down long enough to do his survey of those factors to confirm, yes, I know where I am, I know where I'm going, and I know what time of year it is, etc. Or even if you picked him up, as he was approaching the North Island of New Zealand, and you picked him up while he was asleep and sort of pointed him at sort of the Aleutians or something. The climate's completely changed instantly overnight, as it were. What happens? How fast does he actually figure out he's in the wrong place, etc., etc.?
Within a day, just by the stars, he's going to know instantaneously.
Yes, but he's got to look. And if he's been asleep, when he wakes up, there's no stars.
But within 2 days with clear weather, he's going to know. He's gonna. I guarantee it. I guarantee it. And part of it is because as Westerners, without this domain-specific knowledge, we're lost. So there are even, I've read about groups of people whose base language, and they use their hands and movement when they speak, which, some of us might tie to Annie Murphy Paul's book about externalizing our knowledge or using our body and hands. But there are
just Italian.
There are cultures that in their speech, while they're talking, keep track of, they wouldn't call it in their language north, but they keep track of the direction of where they're at. So while they're speaking, even when they're inside structures that are unfamiliar to them, they will always be indicating a primary direction, so that if you move them around, the way they speak and talk and the cues they have in their environment, even if you pick them up and move them 300 miles away, while that's going on, unless they're just completely unconscious, they're going to know which direction is north because of how they speak, and it's built into the language so that they can then make their way back home.
So Chris, remind me, you're West Coast, right?
Yeah.
Born and bred?
Los Angeles.
Born and bred? Born bred, West Coast? Because you said something about Idaho at one point, if I remember right.
Oh, I didn't catch that. What?
Because I thought you said something about Idaho or Iowa at one point.
No, I don't think so.
Um,
I may be in the past, but not today.
yeah, Doovie, knowing where North is, of course, is a real cliche in The Wire where Buddy Covey, the captain, always does it to new recruits. They say, where are you or which way are you facing? But the link that I sent from Leah Broseski, she's come up, she was talking to some indigenous people, I forget where, but Australasia area comes up. And they don't have left and right, but they know absolutely all of the time north, south, east, and west, such that they will say, my west toe is itching. So, of course, if they got up and sat the other side of the fire and carried on speaking, it would now be their east toe. It's not the same, it's the same toe, but it's now facing the other way. So, yeah. And that's part of why I put that link in, is the language that you have. And I've said it, I'm sure I've said it before. We Western guys think time is effectively horizontal axis. In front of us is the future, and behind us is the past. Mandarin Chinese is vertical. Underground is past, and above is future. And even between English and German, it's 3:15. We go 4:30. Sorry, 3:30. Germans say, in traditional old-style German, 4:30. And then we all say 4:45. So all those subtle little differences. Come on.
Yeah. So can we does this lead us to sort of the next, I don't know if it's chronologically next in chapter 6, his interest and his discussion of sort of levels of genius, which is there I mean, is there a kind of a direct connection here? I mean, I found that stuff interesting once again, but I wasn't really, because he seems to want to go from there to wisdom.
You're mute, Mark.
Yeah. I wonder if there's a difference between understanding, is it a quantitative scale versus a qualitative kind of thing? Is there a point at which things seem to switch? And so there are different ways of understanding or something. I mean, I wasn't sure what that was about either. I mean, it's like, okay, I understand IQ testing and I understand higher and lower scores, but is it more than that?
Yeah, I think for me, the disconnect is he talks about this knowledge and the technology, and then suddenly he jumps into, these polymaths or geniuses, and he doesn't mention at all, how did they learn? How did they acquire the knowledge they have to then be able to show wisdom, generally, I think, through their own experience? He doesn't talk about it at all. And he even, I thought it was kind of odd. He didn't mention S, the mnemonic genius who remembered everything everywhere, but then also had other deficits on the other side. But he does throw out the super common reference to Ramanujan, who, from what I've read of his life and who he was, had some basic experience, but had what I can only presume to be an a non-neurotypical constitution that allowed him to see math in a way most mathematicians who've done it for decades don't know or don't see math, and was able to just intuit is the only way I can say. And I know I've spent decades studying all kinds of crazy areas of math, and after some time of doing this non-professionally, I can intuit a handful of things that should or shouldn't be the case. But Ramanujan was incredibly good at doing this almost from day one without the training or experience to be able to do this. And obviously, over time, with more training, he was able to intuit more things that we don't see. But he doesn't describe any of that here.
Yeah.
And the only thing I have seen that ties a lot of these people together, and probably the best way to explain it is, you go visit Egypt and you see the pyramids at Giza, and you see these massive buildings, and if you have no knowledge of how to build anything at all, it seems magical. But if you have seen a skyscraper under construction, suddenly there's a little less magic because you've seen the scaffolding, you've seen the cranes, you've seen how they do it. And modern engineers have kind of reverse engineered how they must have built sand ramps, or even things like, I think there's an archaeology paper or two about how did you move massive stone blocks over the sand because the friction is too high. But it turns out if you pour a little bit of water on the sand as you go, the friction goes way down, and it's a lot easier to drag that stone over the sand. And to back this up, when you look at pictures or, relief diagrams or pictures from the time, there are people with large vases, presumably of water, walking at the front of these groups of people dragging stones. So yes, maybe that's how they did that piece. So if you don't have the context, the knowing how it happened is way harder. Versus in this group, we all have the context of, here are some practices for taking notes, whether it's a commonplace book or a Zettelkasten, that when used over time will give you a deeper knowledge of what you're looking at and studying, and some combinatorial creativity of, I can take this card from this section and this one from this section, put them together, and suddenly have a new idea that maybe nobody's had before. And almost all of these people, I'm fairly dead certain, had that academic practice as part of their education, and so were able to become geniuses. But people who don't have that background look at them and say, there must be some magic. What was it? And we're just lost.
Well, and I feel kind of lost in this, reading this section, in that he doesn't really, he doesn't. There is no breadcrumb trail, right? I mean, there's kind of a series of, in my mind, kind of random and in my mind quite biased opinions in here, like page 357, 2010. The London Center promoted a paper written by 6 cognitive psychologists and published in the Gerontologist, and it concluded that that people unsurprisingly felt that wise people are more likely to be intelligent, and also a substantial number believed wise people likely to be spiritual. A person who is neither spiritual nor intelligent is unlikely to be wise. No surprises here, he concludes. So to me, that just strikes me as, as an incredible admission of his own bias. Okay, so six cognitive psychologists surveyed 30 people, and on the basis of this, he writes this whole section of the book. That's
Well, I must admit, I sort of, partly because of the sheer info dump in the last bit. I mean, I can't remember how you say the name of it, but I've got an electronic copy and I say rephrases to the size of the screen, but there's a table of Joseph Needham's analysis of Shenhua Greenpool essays, which were written in 1088. So from a Brit point of view, this is 22 years after the Normans took over, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is before we're actually writing in English, even. So, and the list looks pretty impressive. And at that point, I had a nasty feeling and thought, given he knows how to write, he clearly knows how to write, journalist and all that. He's a professional writer.
Mm-hmm.
So let's take away the eloquence that he does by expressing himself and say, what's in these sections, not necessarily chapters, but what's in these sections? And ballpark it. Don't even use Google, but just stay inside Wikipedia. Could you write this book if you had a plan and you had time to go and touch maybe 5 times as many pages in Wikipedia that you actually needed?
Mm-hmm.
And I think you probably could. The thing, the joy of it is the art of the book is hanging all of this off over this slowly stretched out story of his boat trip. That's what makes it all hang together, etc. And that's a good plan. You've got something to hang all these very disparate things on, and when you look at, say, a Wikipedia page on the Indian mathematician, you'll get 5 or 6 times more than what's in there. So you could be throwing away stuff and saying, I'm not going to look at any of those because they take me away too far from anything else that I've already got.
Yeah.
So let me then go back to subtopic number 2, see what references are. Oh, yes, this one is talking about, I don't know, Hooke doing the experiments in London at the Royal Society and his arguments with Newton. I can now talk about Newton. I can now talk about colour because of the prism. Then I could go on to various types of modernist painters for doing paintings with watercolour versus oil versus dot type pictures versus solid blocks of colour versus, all the way out through to the Art Nouveau architecture and stuff. So there was a wonder as in how much of this was written because he knew something of what he's written and then he looked and messed up, or how much of it was, I'm starting here and I'm going to go bounce off my trees in the forest, and this just happens to be one journey. And he's emphasised the metaphor by talking about his boat journey. I wondered.
Well, what about his comparison of Confucius and Aristotle at the end? Because he seems to, at first, it seemed to me like he was going to say, these are 2 great, and kind of influential intellects, and he does say that, but then he kind of very quickly moves on to the idea that, but Aristotle's much better because I'm not exactly sure why. What is it? What element of Aristotle as compared to Confucius is he basing this on, really?
Big thinker alone, I think. partly
That-
because big thinker only, I think, because Confucius lasted because of his influence onto the bureaucracy exams and the morality that went through that, such that it's not hereditary, it's not kings and queens, it's here is the bureaucracy that has been taught that we are moral people. Whereas that doesn't come through on Aristotle in the same way, because he's not going to overthrow a king for no reason. But he'll have a republic, but not that many of them. You know, Sparta wasn't the republic, Thebes wasn't the republic, Athens was.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it struck me that that he was. It seemed to me that he was oversimplifying when he said, you know, Confucius laid down rules, but Aristotle opened doors. I think, and I think that he concludes that and right out in the very next sentence he says, whereas Confucius suggested the existence of the Tao, the way to right behavior, Aristotle showed how virtuous living can and should lead to what so many Greek philosophers famously called eudaimonia, or happiness. Which actually means kind of eudaimonia really kind of means good spirit, right? And that I sort of understand the way a Westerner, sort of engaged in and trained in the Enlightenment tradition would prefer that eudaimonia and this idea that doors are open and that the territory is sort of indeterminate and we get to explore it, versus what a Western Enlightenment trained thinker would assume of Confucius. I'm not sure that it does that depiction really does Confucius justice, though. Although, another thing that I think is probably relevant to say about Confucius is that he apparently thought of himself not as an original thinker, but more of as kind of a cultural conservative, right? That he was that basically what he was doing was calling attention to the canon of 1,500 to 2,000 years of Chinese culture up to that time, and sort of creating an anthology of works and statements and books and readings that people had to absorb in order to understand their culture and then to help run it, which maybe that's a kind of another illustration of that idea of open-endedness that we think of Aristotle as participating in, right? Is that this is okay? Yes, he was, he did follow Plato, who followed Socrates, but that's only a couple of generations. That's not millennia of tradition. So maybe that's part of the thing, part of what we like about about these classical Greeks is that there isn't continuity up to that point, or at least it is not apparent. We don't see where their traditions came from, and so we tend to believe that they burst forth from the brow of Zeus, like Athena.
Yeah. Which assuredly they didn't. But if you even think of Adler's and Hutchins' idea of the great conversation, it starts with Homer, but you get to Plato and Aristotle pretty quickly, and those become kind of the founding texts for the next 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years.
Yeah.
And we pretend that or even things like the Bible and the story of Noah and the Great Flood, we've, as a Western culture, totally ignore 9 times out of 10 the earlier Sumerian and Egyptian traditions that had those stories for thousands of years before the Bible, that even decided, hey, we should write this down.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it does, and we think of that. I mean, we've talked previously about, kind of believing in this kind of axial age, right? That there's this hinge point, and is that for real, or is that just because we don't see what preceded it, and we think that, well, all these ideas must be original and must have, but the whole idea, I mean, it's like the beginnings of agriculture, right? How can agriculture simultaneously begin in all these places around the world at about the same time, unless there is a previous, sort of horticultural tradition? I tend to think that there's undiscovered complexity. I mean, that's the whole Graeber-Wengrow thesis too, though. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I'm overwhelmed by the comparison of two people that were 2 centuries apart, and not to mention the cultures. And perhaps somebody more contemporary to Confucius would be Pythagoras. And the Pythagoras was probably an originator or an influencer of Greek culture 2 centuries later, more so than Aristotle. Aristotle was obviously part of the intellectual elite and the wealth and that sort of thing. Connects to Alexander the Great, kind of put him in a certain status. But Pythagoras, maybe not as wise, we're not sure what that means yet, as Confucius, certainly set upon influencing a smaller culture with spiritual leadership. And then, of course, a way of thinking about the world that was different than Confucius. Most of what we know about that period of time of China, I think, has been lost. So we're really not sure. Plus, the way to talk about knowledge in other cultures varies widely, right? China, and I'm thinking of the Sanskrit scripts of South Asia, is a completely different way of talking about knowledge, and mathematics. I mean, algorithms were expressed in poetry. So the comparison sort of boggles my mind.
Yeah. It's interesting. What I would observe in our in here that we have so far limited our discussion to chapter 6. Do we want to talk about propaganda or or about technology anymore? Did he have anything unexpected to say about Edward Bernays or any of that stuff? Not that we have to change the subject right this moment, but
I will take a second to tie two things together. You were talking earlier about ChatGPT and how he describes it and what we're going to do with it, where it's going. And he doesn't use this framing, but I'm slowly coming around to this perspective, particularly knowing that the step before ChatGPT is predictive text. So you can use your cell phone and start typing a word, and it'll tell you really quickly which word you were trying to type.
Right.
Although my Kindle really sucks at this. But phones generally do a much better job. And so ChatGPT is the next iteration of that, because it uses massive amounts of data to be able to say what should follow logically next. So as a result, ChatGPT is incredibly good at exploring adjacent possibilities. And to tie it back into our language and being able to discern direction and have wisdom come out of it, I think the problem a lot of people have, especially educators with ChatGPT, is it's good at what I think my mom called it diarrhea of the mouse. It can just spew forward lots of stuff, but it's all going to be within the adjacent possible. And what humans are supremely good at is to take things within adjacent possibilities and combine them to make a new thing that's outside of the realm of the known map.
Mm-hmm.
And computers, thus far in all my experience with ChatGPT, really suck at that. So the human piece that we've got that AI doesn't yet and may never is the ability to take all that adjacent possibility and choose a direction. Which way are we going to go to make that next new thing? And so there's a lot of interesting generative stuff, but I have yet to find anybody talking about, they're all impressed because you don't see the black box that's generating this stuff. But what it's saying and what it's coming up with, very rarely, we're surprised, yes, that it can do it, but almost no one is surprised with the results of what comes out of it. Almost all educators I've said are, yes, it's good at throwing stuff at the wall that a freshman could throw out and generate. Sometimes it gets pieces wrong or misses the boat.
Yep.
But I have yet to see someone say it made a massive leap forward. It doesn't, it's, ChatGPT is not doing what Einstein did and changing massively the direction of physics.
Right.
Because he's put space and time together in a new formulation to say, no, this is what's really going on.
Right.
And it's not doing that. So how, and so ChatGPT may throw a bunch of stuff out that sounds right or looks right or is reasonable. But how can you take the tidbits it's doing and then say, here's the next thing, or here's where we go? But the problem too is it's spewing out so much, no one has time to read it and take two different things, put them together and say, here's where we go next.
Right. Which actually is that's really interesting, because that whole next word thing, that as far as I know is still what even GPT-4 is doing. Is, I mean, the only reason that it's better now is apparently because it's scraping a bigger data set and a more current data set and a data set that includes more things that smart people have said and written, right? And so it can plagiarize all of that. I mean, and to be honest, I do think of it as plagiarism, and I do kind of go back to Jaron Lanier's description of translation, right, of Google Translate, right, that all it's doing is it's finding the next, it's finding the word out there, that some human has done, right, or it's finding a word that some human has written and presenting that, and what you just said, Chris, about the next most, statistically, the next most correct word or appropriate word is not necessarily where the creativity is going to come from, right? It's it's the incongruity of stuff. I mean, that's what makes for great, literary, kind of metaphors and poetic surprises and all these things, and Einstein, as you say, but also the thing that really strikes me is that doesn't seem to be, that this thing that we've done with this neural network and this, and this massive application of processing and memory to the corpus of human expression, right? This plagiarism, as you say, is just give me a second to finish this thought, Tim, because otherwise I'll lose it. Is not the way humans think, right? That doesn't seem to be it doesn't seem to model the process. And when we've talked about artificial intelligence on the, in the GPT sense, and, and some path to, artificial general intelligence, it doesn't seem to be replicating our intelligence, right? And so, so that seems to be a real interesting kind of disconnect to me of thinking about how this is going to progress when it's not actually becoming us. It's becoming more effective than us in a certain thing, but ultimately dependent on us because we're the input, right? And that's that, and I wanted to say something earlier about kind of the inputs and the cost of input, right? We think of this whole, we've had, for years now, we've been talking about, if you're not the customer, you're the product, right? We've been thinking about this whole, the idea that our data being scraped, in massive ways by, I don't have an Apple Watch anymore on my wrist because I got tired of Siri listening to me and sometimes interrupting me. But that stuff is not individually valuable. We think about, well, what's the cost? We used to buy, Tim, you said earlier, we used to, the salesman used to come around and sell us the set of encyclopedias. Now we have it for free. Well, it's not really free, but in a way, it's not the same as, oh, this is going to cost me $1,000 of my hard earnings, right? And and so what's a little bit, what's a little bit of data? What's my, my personal identity worth in, in that type of comparison? It just, I think all of that is interesting. And then the last thing that I'll come back to after Tim has a chance to talk is motivation. Because I think that's the thing that's going to be a real question in my mind about AGI. Is what could possibly
go ahead, Tim. It was going back to the elements of the predictive text type stuff, and even when the story about predictive text I like most is reverse. World War II story that we should all know because we've presumably seen chilling story on Bletchley Park and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
And one of the mechanisms of breaking the German code, the clues that we were able to program into the Colossus and so forth, in the bombs, was the German submarines always gave a weather forecast at the end and then finished with Heil Hitler. So irrespective of which, the last 50 characters or something, we knew where the signal came from, so they tried to get a boat or a plane there to take temperatures and check wind directions and all the rest of it. So they would know what was being said, other than, same as with the BBC and the fishing forecast at midnight that is on Radio 4. They always say it in the same sequence. So it's temperature, wind direction, barometer, for this section of the North Sea and the coast around Britain, then this one, then this one, then this one, then this one. It's always in sequence. So, and oddly enough, I send out I'm in the office type thing, and it predicts 3 or 4 of the words I'm about to type from the first letter, and it's always correct, because I'm always using the same terminology. Because what I'm in the office, there's only so many ways of saying it, but it still has logical, grammatical sense. I'm at my desk, I'm in the office, I'm next to the coffee machine, I'm by the water cooler. I've finished my journey in this morning. There are ways you can say it without just jumbling the words, but it's far, if you want to communicate the information and the person expecting it is expecting it in a certain way, and you say it backwards, then there's a high level of confusion possible. So, and in all honesty, I thought we covered chapter 5 with the computer and the calculus and the
Okay.
But They overlap a bit, I'm sure. But the picture of the Texas Instrument and the damage stuff is chapter 5.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
As I think
So
was my listing. They then go on to the Federalist Papers, which we haven't actually mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
I know nothing about those. Tax dodging bastard terrorists.
You know, it's funny. I just got a book. Let me go grab it. I just got this because he does mention that there are the Federalist Papers and they're this thing. I just got this book to get the kind of the other perspective. It's called The Other Founders, right? So anti-federalism, right? And the thing that the dissenting tradition in America, 1788 to 1828. So the way that I understand federalism is as this is almost in the same way that he describes the young Chinese girl and Tiananmen Square, right? that after the event, the history was so rewritten by the winners that that's why I got this book, because I'm looking for names, I'm looking for some primary sources that I can dig into that really express the other, the democratic, the populist democratic tradition that I think was, I suspect was present and was kind of eliminated and then written out of history. So yeah, it does kind of interest me that that is, and I guess it interests me slightly that that he sees it, he sees that destruction of truth, quote unquote, in the Chinese example, and he doesn't really see it in the American example.
I wanted to go back to the comment about plagiarism and GPT.
Mm-hmm.
I have a vague notion of how GPT works, and we talk about scraping data, but if you open up to any page of this book, you see paragraph after paragraph with no references. How is that different than GPT?
That's an interesting question. There are no references. There are citations, though, right? He does say, like on the page that I happen to be on right now, he is talking about Bryn, Page, Hassan, and Tim Berners-Lee. And okay, and he gives some numbers. This is page in my Kindle, it's 304. He gives some numbers of how many sites there were, in each of these websites in each of these different years. And then he talks about this paper, Anatomy of a Large-Scale Hypertextual Web Search Engine. But that's a citation, right? That exists. I mean, it doesn't have an actual footnote, that allows you to, but it is a clue that you can follow, right? So I think that he at least is quoting, when he's talking about Douglas Engelbart's ideas, he's mentioning Douglas Engelbart, right? So that's at least on the way to, he's not presenting, because I think that ChatGPT, unless you really force it and tell it you want citations, it will present all ideas as its own.
No,
I see. Yeah, that probably is a good way to distinguish it.
If you ask ChatGPT to write you a poem in the vein of T.S. Eliot, it will go away and do it, and there won't be any citations because it is its own poem. But if you ask it a question and say, what's the history of temperatures this summer, it will give you, and it will come back with a citation, particularly if you use Perplexity as the front end. Perplexity does it as a footnote for every reference it picks.
Okay.
So, and there's a couple of others that explicitly, where they are picking explicit information up, they are. If, however, you get something to say, can you describe Newton's work on the prism, then you might just get the reference back to Wikipedia page for Newton or Prism, and that's it, because it doesn't need any more.
Mhm.
Perplexity itself, I'm quite impressed with the format of it, because if you cut and paste it, there's a button to copy. So if you push the button to copy, not only does it put a little Perplexity written copyright thing, it gives you the citations as well. But you can also just look at the citations explicitly. So you could just copy the screen of citations. And most of the time, it never really seems to come up with more than 5 or 6 per question. But then you're getting 400 or 500 word answer. And 4, 5, and 6 citations, probably more than enough.
Okay, I just asked it about mean global highest temperatures for the last 20 years, and it gave me a response that has 1, 2.
Tells you at the bottom in total.
There's half a dozen. It has several references. So let me click on one of the references and see. Oh, and it just links directly to it. That's interesting.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
And so far, compared to the straightforward ChatGPT, that was lying as much as Johnson and Trump, I haven't actually found Perplexity to give me a wrong reference. Not to say it's not lying in between the references. I'm just saying it hasn't given me a reference that doesn't exist.
Right. Well, to John's question, then that is an improvement over ChatGPT, which basically seems to naively accept anything that it finds on the web as truth, and that's what generates some of the hallucinations, right?
That's the same thing the American public is doing too. You see it on the internet; it was written down, and it must be true,
right? Yep.
Which is the other thing humans can do, is we have the ability, although it needs to be taught and actually exercised, of looking at 2 separate things and saying, yes, this one is more true than this, or it's true in respect to. I mean, some of the things that Ron DeSantis is pushing for his history curriculum in Florida, some of them are true, but they're also cherry picked, or they're the version of the Potemkin city that's been set up on the skyline, and you can look at it and it looks like a real thing, but as you approach it and look at it in closer context, you realize it's not as true as other things that are around it, because you now have that context.
Yeah. Well, and there's a question of scale too, right? That there are and those are maybe the humanities related tools of thought that we are that we should be maybe more explicitly trying to teach people, is this question of context, question of motivation, right? Like who benefits, right? I mean, that's often a direction that I go in, but also scale, right? Because I'm reviewing, one of the things that I'm doing in my spare time is I'm reviewing an academic, what's it called? U.S. Academic Decathlon is this coming year, 24-25, is going to have a curriculum or a project on environmental history. And so they contacted me to kind of review their curriculum content and the packet that they're going to send out. And so I started working on the first section of it, and it's talking about the terminology. It's really sort of setting the scene in the first chapter about the terminology of environmental, especially climate history, and earth system science and things like that. So it's trying to explain concepts like positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement and feedback loops and things like that. But one of the things that I sort of gently critiqued them about this week was scale, right? Because they're talking, when they mention positive feedback, they're talking about that global the global warming, triggers, northern hemisphere. Well, it triggers Arctic sea ice melting, right, which reduces albedo, and so that's a positive feedback effect. And then when it gives a negative feedback effect, because temporally it's sort of focused on the Anthropocene, it can't find, it really can't actually find a good idea, a good moment of sort of global negative feedback. So it picks some local negative feedbacks, which are negative feedbacks, but but it's sort of unbalanced, right? And so scale, I think, is also kind of relevant, and that's one of those things that I think humans can critique, right, and can recognize when they're thinking critically about stuff that it seems like it would be very hard to program.
Yeah. Although that scale thing is also tough when it comes to statistics, because human beings are terrifically bad at guessing future outcomes. You usually can sit down and with some thought figure it out and come to a conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
But things like the kind of the birthday paradox, how many people do you need to have in a room such that the probability that two people share the same birthday out of 365 days is 50-50. People are horrible at that. Unless you just know the answer or can sit and calculate it for a few minutes.
What's the answer? 26?
Yeah. And so unless you've heard that problem before or know roughly what that is, well, people suck at that.
Yeah.
Well,
that's not intuitive.
That
Yeah.
scale.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and statistics is very is hard. I don't know. It seems to me that most people have trouble developing an intuitive sense about statistics.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the other thing, of course, is thinking, instead of being numerate for a minute, let's think graphically. If you have a 3x3 set of dots on a piece of paper, now join all those 9 points up with 4 straight lines without taking a pen off the paper.
Oh yeah, you got to go outside the.
If you, I was going to say, if you know, don't say the answer. If you don't know the answer, and you've been living your life in a rectilinear world of rooms and buildings,
Mm-hmm.
you have no chance, or you have very little chance. Whereas if you've been living in round buildings, you don't see the 3x3 as a boundary.
Is that the difference? Round buildings? Wow. Yeah.
Apparently, yeah. So
Okay.
apparently, Eskimo, Inuit, whatever the current name is, solve that problem fine, as do a lot of Africans, because they don't live in square buildings.
And Mongolians in yurts? Yeah. That would be an interesting cross-cultural study.
How fast? Yeah.
Yeah.
But, and it's like, so far, other than those Europeans that do what Chris just did and did it straight off because he knew the answer, and you mentioned, if you don't actually know the answer, even if you give it to school kids below the age of 12, where they're not quite fixed, it takes them a while. Some of them get there, but not all.
The big question is, do we define thinking outside the box as this? Or as this group might prefer, thinking outside the box is this? Which thinking outside the box are we actually doing?
Well, but in the second one that you're talking about, Chris, the box is necessary as a set of data to take outside and manipulate.
Yeah. Or even one of my favorite examples of that in this book, and I love that he has it in the kind of ChatGPT AI section. He tells the story of the invention of GPS, and we're listening to signals from outer space coming down to Earth, and some engineers sit down and play around with it and look at it, but then it takes someone else, then the head of the applied physics lab, I presume they were still in Columbia at that time, he says, hey, we're taking this signal from here and bringing it down, let's reverse the problem, and we can use it to then calculate positions on Earth.
That seems to be one of those human outside the box moments. Yeah.
But that kind of thought is not the kind of thought you're going to see coming out of ChatGPT. So for the educators who are worried about ChatGPT, yeah, let students go wild and use it. Make sure they check their sources and that what they're getting out of GPT is actually a thing and it exists and isn't an hallucination. But then how can you use those pieces and use a book like Umberto Eco's How to Write a Thesis? How it can put those pieces together to create the thing in your essay that ChatGPT will never come up with. You can regurgitate things all day long, but can you use that tradition in the humanities to put three insane ideas together and create a new fourth?
Well, and even the really, even not even a thesis, but the Shelley poem, right, on my page 313, right, Ozymandias, right, where GPT-2 completes the sonnet, and maybe GPT-4 would do better, but okay, so it's interesting, but there's no point, right? Which again goes to that question of motivation. Shelley had a point that he was making, right? This poem seems to me to be kind of interesting as well. And I will caveat this and say I haven't actually asked GPT to write poems for me, anything like that. So I have no direct experience with this, but it seems like it would be very difficult for it to say, well, I have this idea that I want to convey to a reader in metaphor or figuratively or in a poetic story or something, and that motivation level is what is the thing that's missing, right? That that there is no look upon my works ye mighty and despair. There's no message that motivates the writing of the GPT poem. It's just
going back to the GPS thing about reverse the solution, reverse the problem, and come up with a different one. The other book that this reminded me of is Bill Bryson's A Short History of Nearly Everything. And he has the story of, I think it's Stanford, was looking for something actively, and some people up the road that had the other radio satellite dish stroke aerial array spoke to Stanford to ask them, can you come and help us to try and get rid of this piece of what seems to be background noise?
That's the story of the cosmic background radiation. Yeah. And
it's like we're looking up for this problem, and they're looking down to solve that one, and we haven't quite joined up. And it's like the ChatGPT couldn't be a third person on the phone for that.
Well, and also the value that you have to be able to recognize that there is a value in that reversal, right? So so with the GPS, right, the guy in the labs looks at that and he says, well, okay, it would be useful to know where people are on Earth, right? How's GPT going to assess that?
But then to counter your poem thing, and the other thing that I think has got a little lost in some of this conversation is the AI is responding to our questions. It's not creating this for no reason. The reason is with us. So if you actually ask ChatGPT 4, since you've got that access, to write and that to write version 2 of Ozymandias in the style of Shelley, to get a decent poem that is a part 2 needs to give them that one extra piece of information that is the motivation for writing this is whatever, you know, how to survive a revolution as opposed to how to survive time, because no matter everything breaks up and dies away eventually. And for all you know, it might flip onto a biological example and write a poem such that it reminds you that you are not you in terms of the same atoms as of 6 months ago. Or something. Now, do we now say that that is a creative leap? Or is it there is a number of leaps it could make, and it made one of the ones it picked fail? What changes are they? Okay, we can follow Sagan and his "We are all made of stardust" and carry on from there, because that's clearly a big thing. Like Ozymandias is reminding people who thought stone buildings were everlasting, etc., empires would outlive their founders. And most don't.
I just asked ChatGPT to write a sequel, and let me see if I can copy and paste it for you. No, I won't. Let me see if I can send this. Well, how do I do this?
A sequel, but with what other conditions?
Just a sequel. I said, write a sequel to Shelley's Ozymandias in poetry. And let me see if I can get it. I'll do a couple of steps here. I'll put it in Word. Yeah.
Well, the other thing I don't see ChatGPT doing either is taking big touchstone moments in history or cultural references that almost all people will get, or at least most educated will get, and be able to infuse those into broad swaths of things. So if you're a novelist in your writing, you know, you know, you'll see in movies and TV and novels regurgitations of the stories from Homer recast in new periods. You know, things like "Oh brother, where art thou?"
Yeah.
You know, that is not going to be a ChatGPT output anytime soon.
Right.
Because even though it's got the data to look at it and understand it, will it have that ability to take associative memory that lots of people have and place into it? Or even things like one of the things I find fascinating about this book is there's a lot of weird contextual things that Simon Winchester throws into the book that if you are not a member of Western culture and society and didn't grow up in it, you're going to miss all these subtle, weird references that he makes because they're just going to go over your head. You're not going to see them at all. And so without someone pointing out to you what they are, or even how he came to things, you know, his Falkland Islands or his, you know, Bloody Sunday stories. In the Bloody Sunday case, he at least says, I was a journalist who covered it at the time, so I can look back on it. But without that context, or without the context of knowing that he has written travel logs of going from Britain into the Balkans during the war, before the war and after the war, to compare what was, you know, going on in the 70s or 80s versus what happened in the early 90s and how those things changed. Without those contexts, you might read this and miss those references, which for me is probably one of the more interesting pieces reading this book, is having read almost all of his other work, is just how much heavy overlap is going on in this book compared to other things he's written in the past.
Yeah.
but the casual reader who just picks this up as the first thing they've ever read from him is going to miss all of that context.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting.
Oh, something too that occurs to me, and maybe it was something Mark said earlier, Mark and Dan saying about the humanities disappearing. Maybe it's just totally not related, but I find it entertaining to see the new school in Florida reshaping itself totally based on core humanities everything, other than we're going to try and make this financially successful by giving it an athletic department.
Mm-hmm.
I just have to throw my hands up in desperation.
Yeah, I saw a meme on, I don't know if it was, I don't know, some social media in the last couple of days that said that, that higher ed nowadays is just kind of it's pre-professional sports, with
If you're at a higher level education establishment and the highest paid person is the sports coach, you're at a sports franchise with a fantasy of an education.
that was it. Yes. Yes, where the highest paid person is the head coach of the football team. Yes, that was which is probably the case here I work.
What? I don't even know what is Bemidji State's mascot.
Well, the Beaver, the Bemidji Beavers, and we have a D1 hockey team that actually does place a lot of people in the NHL. We have a D2 football team, which sucks, and we have a crappy baseball team. But we apparently, because and we're looking into it right now because of our financial difficulties. Apparently, if by the way all of the rules of the NCAA and other organizations work, if we were to try to drop from D2 to D3 in football, that would trigger a cascade of events that would make it impossible for us to be Division I in hockey, right? Which is sort of required, right? We can't get away from that. And so, so there's this kind of weird interlocking set of kind of regulations and protocols and stuff that impossible.
Sounds like a job for ChatGPT.
Yeah, right.
Well, you should look into it, and maybe it was a grandfather clause that got it, but Johns Hopkins manages to be D1 in lacrosse while everything else is D3 or off the map entirely.
Yeah. Part of it had something to do with if we went down a division, then we would be grouped with a bunch of other institutions that were for the most part much smaller private liberal arts colleges and not universities. And so it's just there's all kinds of weirdness.
And flipping through, I made a note here. And this totally changes the topic, but
yes, do change.
Since we're off on D1 and D3 sports in the Midwest, Winchester kind of poo-poos. I've got it on page 343, roughly. That's section 11 on Bertrand Russell. He kind of throws Gladstone under the bus.
Mm-hmm.
In repeating quotes about his studies on Homer. And of course he was, I think, the British Prime Minister, became British Prime Minister, but a super unknown fact about him, he studied Homer super intensely.
Yes.
And is actually known as the guy who realized the word blue does not appear as a color in any of Homer's works.
Right.
And so we
get dark sea. Yeah, I saw that.
We get that phrase "wine dark sea," but that phrase and those repeated phrases were what allowed who it was Lord and I'm gonna his name will come to me in a second. But in the head of classics at Harvard, essentially had his short lifelong thesis was those little turns of phrase that were heavily repeated all throughout Homer.
Mm-hmm.
And then he essentially said it was a cultural phenomenon, that it was singing practices that were handed down generation to generation that created what we now know as Homer. And someone at some point just wrote it down, but there was no Homer who sat down and composed what we now know as Homer. And to me,
Homer was an algorithm.
that is, Homer is an algorithm is essentially the way to put it, but it also points out that's, to me, the type of thing that ChatGPT and AI are heavily likely in my lifetime to be able to come up with that kind of thesis. And that's a thesis that literally turned a huge swath of literature and classic studies on its ear. That's not even in an adjacent possibility kind of discovery. That's we're working off the map altogether.
Well, and that does seem likely. I think you're right, because the thing's ability to see, I mean, and that to some extent, isn't that what's happening with sort of predictive algorithms in in trading, right, in the market right now, is that that big data is finding correlations that are not apparent to anybody, right? And and that does give the people who control and own the what Jaron Lanier calls siren servers, kind of that advantage and that kind of magical ability. Alfred Lord, yeah. Cool. Wisdom, going back to that, he gives a 9-point list. Which
Who knows, it's so easy to be wise. Just 9 points. Just 9 points and you too can be wise.
It's uniquely human. It involves advanced cognitive and emotional development. Well, at least he didn't say it's spiritual. It's driven by experience. It's personal. It's rare. It can be learned. It can be measured. It increases with age. It cannot be enhanced by taking drugs. Oh man. Which again, I mean, and since he brought it up, right? The whole interest that so many people have had recently, Michael Pollan and others in psychedelics and in the idea that it allows for, I guess, what I can only think of as like sort of habits of mind and structures of thinking to at least be temporarily broken down in a way that enables different things that aren't adjacent in our, I mean, it's like the disciplinization of higher ed, right? We've got these things in their own silos, and then this thing comes along and temporarily, breaks down all the walls, and we see this connectedness, or we see these, we see these connections that aren't otherwise apparent to us. At this point, that doesn't seem to me to be worth the risk of permanent derangement. But maybe later in my life I will have a different opinion about that. But that is derangement, right? I mean, and how much is wisdom, or how much is insight, or how much is originality, that ability to temporarily derange and then bring something back from that journey.
Or how much is it having an immense amount of context and being able to take situations in which you've been trained to do these things, but then when something goes wrong, have you been trained well enough that, let's say your plane is going down into the water in New York, are you able to use that experience to create wisdom to be able to safely land that plane when no one else could or likely would have. And literally people are saying, hey, or they blame you initially and say it was your fault the plane went down and this or that happened. But then, when you study it a little longer, you realize, wait, he used that experience in ways that no one else would have and under intense circumstances.
Yeah.
And then you have movies made about you because, that's the whole point, right?
Right. Yes, he did it. He did it for the movie. Yeah. And then we got the Manhattan Project and the wisdom of the bomb.
Did he ever actually give us a good concrete definition of what he thought wisdom was? So I felt like he's talking around it and about it and never says, here's the thing, here's what it is, or what it should be. Or even I went out and dusted off an old copy of, it would have been volume 3, I think, of the Great Books of the Western World. And, there's all the references to wisdom across, 2,500 years of Western writing. And yeah, he didn't even manage to mention that as here's how wisdom has been defined across the ages.
Right. Yeah, he does seem to sort of assume that he is talking to a friendly reader at this point. That the wisdom, the implication is that the wisdom is unilateral nuclear disarmament.
Yeah,
that would be the wise choice, and that a wise choice, and he even almost kind of implies that a wise choice would have been not to have the Manhattan Project in the first place, to preemptively, unilaterally, say we are going to, we're aware that this is a possibility and we're going to forbear from. We're not going to pursue it, and then he says that and then anybody who did it would be an international pariah, which I don't know that would be much of a consolation if the Nazis had got there first and won the war. So
well, I don't know that. Because game theory essentially was born in the early 1930s with Morgenstern and gang. And I don't think it had reached a point mathematically that it would have been clear then that mutually assured destruction means the wise choice is not to go there. Or as we all know now, having seen the movie War Games, would you like a nice game of chess instead? So the wisdom some of it may be thinking ahead, but if the other side you're fighting against is not wise, you're then forced into that that game scenario anyway, until the other side does eventually figure out, hey, we can't sustain it economically or it's killing our country, or we can't win, so quit playing the game altogether. And I think in the Cold War situation, it was really more collapse that drove it rather than the wisdom of we can't do this. It was really the wisdom of economics saying we can't support it. Which may be why we still have a Russian leader now who is not necessarily the wisest guy out there either.
Again, that I think that strikes me as a question of motivation, and that kind of maybe coming all the way back around, because we're rounding out on 2 hours now, strikes me as the whole question for artificial intelligence is what, aside from the fact that we can program, we can say, okay, this is your programming. Do this, and then it does it. our motivations are kind of, you know, based in all of this evolutionary experience, survival and fear of not surviving and all of that. Yeah, I don't know what I don't know how motivation would figure into. I mean, I don't see Skynet in this. I don't see what, you know, what would motivate Skynet. You know, I guess fear that the plug is going to be pulled on it.
Or the unintended consequences of decisions you make. So if you're shilling for the cigarette industry and you want to sell more cigarettes, well, let's sell cigarettes to women who don't smoke. And you get that, but in getting it, you also, in some sense, kick off and play into, you know, expanding acceptability of women doing more than just smoking. And you get that unintended consequence of equality jumping out of the horrible thing of selling cancer sticks to a bigger audience.
But it also kind of goes back to that other question about, you know, what's the rhetoric and what's the reality, right? And it seems like there's a self-conscious use of this you know, the freedom thing, you know, freedom for women as a, you know, as something that, you know, that advertisers and tobacco company executives don't really give a shit about, but, you know, they know that it will it's a button that they can press. So yeah,
and he doesn't explore that, I think, enough, that equality thing arising out of it, or its consequences on this second half of that century.
Yeah.
But I think he mentioned twice in the book the phrase decision momentum, which I thought was a fantastic phrase, or at least fantastic enough that I Googled it and found that it doesn't exist as a thing in general, or it doesn't seem to be well defined. But he talks about it in the construct of nuclearization, and then he also separately talks about Kuwait, although I don't think he uses decision momentum in that context. I have to go back and look. But that's another spot where the decision momentum was moving along, where we've made this decision, we're going to do this. Now we just need to give the evidence to back it up and propagandize our way into it. But I'm super curious about.
Well, there's an element of sleight of hand there too. Like, focus on this while this is going on in the, you know.
Or the lack of, you know, like watching the rise of Trump slowly beat out all his contenders to be the surprise candidate that wins the Republican nomination. And I think if you'd asked 2 years earlier, no one would have said, yes, this is a thing. And that almost becomes an example of indecision momentum of, we can't decide. We all know we don't want this, but we don't say it. And as a result, we end up with it.
Right, but that's also an effect of that you know, the mainstream media rubbernecking the whole time, and you know, and knowing that this is, you know, that this is the horror that people won't be able to drag their eyes away from, and so he gets all of that unearned media. Yeah.
But for me, that was one of the more interesting little quirks of the book, was just that one phrase.
Yeah. Decision momentum. That is a good phrase.
And that's something that apparently, you know, I'll have to dig around. It's probably studied, but studied under some other name.
Right.
Yeah. But if somebody figures out what that other name is, let me know. I'm super curious.
Okay. So for next week, part 1 of Oreskes and Conway, the foundations part.
Sure.
Which begins with a quotation from Echo: "Those things about which we cannot theorize, we must narrate." So back to storytelling.
I know Patrick's read a chunk of it, at least, if not all of it already. You got any advice? Should we be, and I've already noticed even in the introduction, there's a lot of kind of overlap with, and I'm kind of going to syntopically read it with Donut Economics.
They spend an inordinate amount of time on National Association of Manufacturers. And I got so bored with it, particularly since I know a fair amount about NAM, that I found myself skipping a lot of the parts of the first 11, 12 chapters. So.
NAM as a predecessor of the libertarian kind of free market movement? Is that the way they use that?
They very much promoted that idea of the free market.
Yeah. Yeah, they seem to be a big funder of the Foundation for Economic Education and all those early kind of.
But the thing I found disappointing in the book is that this big buildup about a century of big business controlling the political dialogue, in essence, was that they don't go the next step. And maybe they're going to write a third book about current politics, because one party in particular has taken this thesis that this whole book, The Big Myth, is about, and that's become their doctrine.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, it does seem like, I mean, where I'm expecting it to fit is sort of as the, as I was just talking about the difference between the rhetoric and the reality, as sort of the rhetorical cover that, that this, sort of plutocracy uses to get its to get its way, to justify and kind of cover itself. Well, okay, so then part one, I guess the introduction and part one for next. Is it next week? What is I apologize for my crazy calendar this summer, guys. Are we going next week or are we not? Next week would be the 5th of. Is that right? The 5th of September. I think that works.
Also,
yeah. No, the 5th of August. I'm sorry, the 5th of August. I don't even know what month I'm in.
Also, Nate, our friend Nate, with his bookshelf behind him.
Yeah.
Dropped in last week because I missed your cancellation at 3 hours. I foolishly checked while you were still asleep. I realise now.
Yes, that was like I said, I have not been.
So Nate and I turned up just to let you know that your Zoom is still running when you're not there.
Okay, yeah, because it's a scheduled meeting. Yeah, just turns on. Yeah. Okay. Then Saturday the 5th. Same.
If you haven't done it already, I know Nate sent me an email and said put him back on the list. I think he wants this next book.
Okay, yeah, I will. I'll make sure I get that, and I'll get a kind of a more general announcement out to everybody, and I'll make sure he's on that general mailing list.
He said he did say he was going to email me, but he didn't say he hadn't got your mail.
Okay. All right, I will. I'll make sure
it'll help even out the amount of gray hair on the call.
Yep. Yeah, which will be a good thing. All right. Well, thank you. This was a good conversation.
Ciao, ciao.
Good one. Thanks, Dan.
See you next week.